wasn't done because of someone's race. That came after a period of time, not because of the religion. Yeah.
And also, is it fair to equate Arab slavery with European slavery? Because is it not a different?
No, I don't. I think it's a different. I think again, they were both horrific practices, but I don't think you can compare the two in a sense that what the Europeans did was like chattel slavery. And again, just another thing as well that I think we need to as well, and I'm myself a victim of this as well. When we think of slavery and slaves, we shouldn't be thinking of black people, because that's a thing that comes to most people's minds nowadays. If you were to say slavery, slaves, you automatically think of racialized slavery because of what happened in transatlantic slave trade. Now I know it's troubling for some people to believe, but Africans enslaved Africans as well. Do you understand? That's what Arab enslaved. So again, I'm not trying to condone the practice or whatever, but when you're looking at the Arab slave trade, it's not the same. Again, I'm not justifying all the Arab slave trade. Arabs enslaving black people, Arabs enslaving Indians as well. And I'm not saying that is Islamic in any, but it's not. It wasn't racialized the way it was as what happened in the transatlantic slave trade, but some parts of it was.
It's an interesting conversation to have in contemporary understanding of like slavery as well, no? Because when you go to much of the Arab world that does still, how I would frame it, still practices slavery, and say in a lot of the Khaliji countries, there is a racialized element to it.
But I would argue it's not racialized, it's more about your tribe. So if you're not, because like in with the European slave trade, if you looked like, if you was non-white, they would target you, right? Yeah. Whereas the Arabs, obviously we know that some Arabs are very light in complexion, some very dark in complexion. A very dark in complexion Arab would enslave a more lighter in complexion black African, not because he's
due to like class hierarchy and
because he's not from the same tribe. And again, that's something that we need to understand, especially that's what I wanted to do in the beginning of this, is understanding terms. Now people use terms, so even when Malcolm X was assassinated, was it 51 years ago, the way they use terms is very different than we use some terms now. That's why it's important, before we kind of get into any discussion, it might sound like it's this guy reading a dictionary, but you need to understand what I mean by certain terms, because I might use a term now, and we saw obviously recently what happened with, I'm not going to name the name of the university that used two figures for Black History Month that were of Pakistani and Indian descent, because again, then it's understand what you mean by, whether you agree with it or not. But if you understand, if Black history or black, you're referring to political blackness, there's nothing wrong with that.
I don't know. I think the conversation is worth having.
That's a bit sidetracked, but again, it's just. But
I think that it's definitely worth kind of exploring like what is meant by political blackness, and like to what extent it can hijack like genuine, obviously, like say African voices as well. So,
but that's why I wanted to say, by me referring to black during this talk and discussion, I'm referring to people of African descent, dark-skinned people of African descent. Again, so that's I think that's important that you understand. So when I'm talking about Malcolm fighting for the plight of black people, if you were to incorporate all non-white people within that, the problem with that is that, so you're including people that even like Japanese people of fair in complexion, then you won't deal with the issue of, which he spoke about a lot, about the whole idea of Africanness or Africa seen in a negative light. And that's something that he wanted to address. That again, mainly talking to the 22 million African Americans, but by extension Africans across the diaspora, this idea that, and he spoke about, like for example, the people in Brazil, 2/3. I mean, the reason he's brought, that's what even sparks some of my interest to go to Brazil as well. So he spoke about 2/3 of the people in Brazil are non-white. They're people of African descent, but this idea that people in Brazil or people in Venezuela or people in Colombia are not African because they speak Spanish or Portuguese. They're Latin or Hispanic, which is ridiculous. And people even today, they'll consider them, no, they're not black. So a lot of African Americans will say that they're of African descent, they're black, and then people of the Caribbean and Latin America, those who look exactly like them and have got the same makeup, are not black because they speak a different language. Do you understand? So that's why it's important to understand, and that's something that Malcolm was trying to do, and he was talking about the whole idea of not only about colorism, but the whole idea of characteristics or African features. Sorry, I think that's something that's important, because he was talking about that. Why is it and obviously we know that Beyonce used some of his famous speeches, which raised awareness because he was talking about, again, the plight of black women, and how the whole idea and the concept of beauty and why is that we as black people as well. And this is something as well which Malcolm X did do. And again, I think it's important to understand he was unapologetic, but he wasn't trying to preach to white people in terms of for them to accept us. It was all about trying to change the mindset of black people or people, and then towards the end of his life, non-white people. You're trying to change your mindset, so this decolonize your mind. So rather than trying to go to white people, Europeans, to accept us, he was teaching us to kind of accept ourselves the way we are and our God-given features and embrace it and celebrate it, rather than like celebrate when a white person, like says that we're intelligent, beautiful, and this, that, and the other. So I think that's something that's very important, and that comes down to also the whole idea of why Africa's always seen as a bad light. And it spoke about why the colonial powers, they projected Africa with like savages and jungles and things like that. People wanted to escape the Africanness. I've kind of gone over the 30 minutes, even maybe 40 minutes. These are some rambling thoughts.
Sure. Is there anything important that you want to touch on the presentation before we get to the question session?
That's what I said wasn't important.
No, I'm saying just any in the remaining. Because obviously I interrupted your flow.
No, fine. No, I mean, the rest is quite self-explanatory. One of the questions which I had at the end, which I kind of spoke about as well, was I read an interesting article where someone was in the Telegraph, and I've heard this from other people as well, and this ties into what you were talking about the Arab slave trade and things like that. And I've heard this from a number of people that, because obviously we know that Malcolm X's life was one of evolution and change when he came across new material and new truths, and he wasn't scared to embrace his new truths. One thing that this particular writer said, and I've heard it from other writers as well, is if Malcolm X knew about the anti-black racism which exists, because to be honest, reading the letter from Mecca is beautiful, but it doesn't speak about the realities of anti-black racism which exists in the Muslim community. Maybe Malcolm didn't experience that. So what a number of this writer and other writers are saying is that if Malcolm X if he lived long enough to see the anti-black racism which exists within the Muslim community, he probably would have left Islam the same way he left the Nation of Islam. Now, I would argue against that because, and again, this is important to understand his identity. He wasn't someone who was a Muslim because of other Muslims, right? He wasn't a Muslim because other people's Muslims. And something that he did say even in his autobiography as well, especially after he found out about the infidelity of Elijah Muhammad, he realized that how dangerous it is to put all your faith in one person, or to believe someone is divine. Which again, from an Islamic perspective, we don't believe any human being is divine. So just because if he were to find out about the anti-black racism which exists unfortunately in many Muslim countries and has existed in Islamic history, I don't think that would have changed his perception about Islam, because he wasn't someone that was like, again, his faith wasn't solely based upon the fraternity of the Muslims. Do you understand? That changed his outlook in terms of his views or perception of whiteness, because like he mentioned, when he was in Mecca and he saw people that in America would be considered white, but he said like Islam had moved the whiteness from their understanding. Do you understand? Again, but the reason why he said that, and I think it's important, is because even when I speak to a number of even my North African friends, they don't consider themselves white. But maybe in America he might be considered to be white. So again, that's why I think it's important, because that changed, the trip changed his perception to the race relations, but not his understanding in terms of who God is. And again, you have to remember that he came from a religious background, where his father was a religious person, believed in God. So this understanding that, if he found out about the practices of Muslims in the past, and like the Zand rebellion and all the rest of it, he would have somewhat left Islam. I would argue against it, because he was someone that was dedicated ultimately to God, serving God, not trying to serve and please human beings. And that's why he could always change in terms of if new information came to light about certain people's practices.
Yeah, for real. Okay, thank you very much for